So good.
Hi there. I'm Janyce McGregor from CBC Radio. Just wondering why you've come. Why is it important to you to try some Canadian cheeses?
2 words, wine and cheese, or 3, I guess.
Can I give you another word? Patriotism. Do you feel like it's a patriotic time when it comes to the choices you make as a consumer?
Yes, for sure. Proud Canadian and want to purchase things from, my country I live in and make sure that we're doing well.
With tensions with the United States running as high as they've been since the mid-19th century, more than 100 cheesemakers and dairy farmers gathered on the grounds of Old Fort Henry on the shores of Lake Ontario.
An event like this is very, very important to show that we don't need cheese from anywhere else. We have all the good stuff right here.
Fort Henry was built to protect Canadian trade routes.
How ironic, right? It is kind of interesting when I was out on the boat cruise and you see the fort and you think, are we going to have to use that now? I hope they have a lot of cannonballs up there. Let's hope it doesn't come to that.
I'm Janyce McGregor, sitting in for Catherine Cullen, and this week on The House, we're staring down the barrel of a long, hot trade summer, and it's not quiet on the fronts of Canada's trade war. Was it tactical to cave on the digital services tax? Can the Prime Minister hold the line for Canadian farmers? Is the new trade minister lining up allies to reinforce Canada's economy? We'll ask him. And you'll meet a former Australian trade negotiator so fed up with misinformation that he wrote a book about why he thinks politicians lie about trade. Yet somehow he kept his sense of humor. En garde! This special edition of The House is now in session. The week began with Canada beating a retreat on its digital services tax.
Last night I had a good conversation with President Trump, and we agreed to recommence our negotiations.
Another tax now axed, seemingly a direct response to Donald Trump's threat to walk away from the negotiating table. The White House saw its opening and spun it.
It's very simple. Prime Minister Carney in Canada caved to President Trump in the United States of America.
So, where does this leave trade talks with the United States, with just over 2 weeks to go before the July 21st deadline that Mark Carney set at the G7 in Kananaskis? To unpack the strategy on this, Inu Monik is a trade policy fellow with the Council on Foreign Relations in Washington, but also a Canadian, originally from BC, and Julian Ovens served as Chief of Staff to Canadian international trade ministers through the disruptions of the first Trump administration. He's now a partner with Crestview Strategy. We spoke earlier in the week. Welcome both of you to the House.
Thanks for having us.
Good to see you in the seat, Janice.
Julian, I want to start by asking how the concession earlier this week on the digital services tax shakes up these talks now underway between Donald Trump and Mark Carney. We have known that the DST was on Washington's hit list for months, but now it appears to have been conceded just for the privilege of not losing Canada's spot in the negotiating queue. So what did you make of that?
Yeah, I'm not sure that, while it wasn't handled fantastically well, I think here in Ottawa, I'm not sure it really changes very much. A lot of folks thought it was going to be gone anyway. And if you think of how President Trump handles crises, he often creates a crisis, fixes 80% of it, and calls it a win. He's somebody who has a sizable ego, really cares about face. So there's always a balance in letting him save enough face to continue a conversation, but not do it so much that you look weak. And I think, fundamentally, if the talks don't go well, Canada can bring it back.
Opposition politicians here in Ottawa were pointing out that this didn't seem terribly elbows up of Canada, but did Mark Carney have any choice?
At the end of the day, I don't think that Prime Minister Carney had much of a choice but to back down from the DST. There was no way to sort of deal with this throughout the course of negotiations because Trump was fairly firm that this meant we're not talking anymore. So I think he had his hand tied there. But at the same time, it seemed like this was something that was being considered as a concession to give up at some point. Maybe this is a bit earlier than when he would have wanted to give it up. But at the end of the day, I feel like it was something he had to do in order to keep the talks going.
Here's what confuses me, though, because earlier this spring, when that so-called framework deal was done between the U.S. and the U.K., the British did not have to give up their version of the DST to get that deal, as sort of interim or temporary as it might be, appreciating that there are still some talks ongoing between them. So why couldn't Canada get a similar situation, Julian?
I think it is unpredictable, but look, he created big, huge fusses around China. He imposed all sorts of new tariffs and said things that, they'd never be able to reach a deal, and then all of a sudden, they reach a deal. So it really seems to be his MO. And I actually think our Prime Minister is looking at the big picture.
And there were stakeholders here that wanted it too. We have to acknowledge it.
Including the opposition.
Yeah. I want to talk about the road forward now towards this July 21st deadline, because when it was set, Canadian officials said the U.S. hadn't been responding to the offers that they were putting on the table. They needed to put a marker down, add some pressure, focus some minds. Based on what you've seen in Washington, was that smart? Was that necessary tactically for Canada?
Well, I think the negotiations so far have been quite chaotic and unpredictable. And it was, I think, a good idea for Canada to say, look, we need to get this concluded by a certain point in time, and let's sort of clear the air before it gets too deep into the summer. So I do think it's smart because the administration here is juggling a lot of different things. They said they were going to get 10 to 12 deals done, potentially by Labor Day. So Canada needs to get ahead of that and find a way to resolve some of these major tariff issues before we even get to the bigger question of USMCA review, which is going to start kicking off later this fall. So I think it was a smart idea to push a little for an earlier date, but at least it's not the July 9th date, which is what everyone else is watching right now in a scramble to get some deals done.
July 9th, just to help our audience, is of course the date they've set for some of these conversations with other countries. Do you think, Inu, that what happens around that July 9th deadline for other countries could have a bearing on what happens with Canada on July 21st?
Absolutely. The president has been very frustrated that there haven't been more deals concluded already. So we only have one deal so far. That's with the United Kingdom. There are potential other deals that could be wrapping up soon. We heard Vietnam potentially wrapped up, but we haven't seen any text of that. There are several others that seem to be in queue, such as India, the EU. No deal for Japan, it looks like. But what the president needs are a bunch of wins by July 9th, because he needs to show that his strategy is working. And I think that if we don't see a lot of deals coming out of this, what we're likely to see is him to get more agitated and ask for more concessions from the countries that he knows he can push a little harder. And so I think for Canada, that would be a very bad situation. So hopefully there will be a string of deals that get announced next week, and then Canada can just pick up where it left off.
Julian, you were kind of nodding your head there as Ina was talking. Mark Carney previously said he'd take the time he needed, but no more. But by setting this deadline, he sort of put a marker down, after which maybe his critics could say, well, you've failed. So would you have advised the Prime Minister to set a time limit like this?
Deadlines are a funny thing. So it's important to think about the context around setting that deadline. It was around the G7, which we hosted. And there were some rumors at the time that we were going to have a deal with the Americans by the G7. So it allowed us to have an announceable at that event to say, well, maybe we haven't gotten to where people were saying we were going to be, but we're going to get there. We're going to get there soon. I think the Prime Minister Carney also needs early wins. You can always extend a deadline. You have to be careful as a negotiator that you aren't sort of fabricating a pretend deadline that you then have to trade off real results against. So if it gets to that, he'd obviously have to revise it. But also it demonstrated that he and President Trump could agree to some small things, right? And to be civil enough to agree to a timeline like that.
When I studied negotiation tactics, I was taught that the person who needs the deal the most is often the one with the weaker hand at the table. Is that Canada right now?
Unfortunately, I think Canada does have the weaker hand right now, mainly because President Trump thinks that he can go ahead and impose all these tariff barriers and not face any consequences. So he's not facing any political consequences right now. There isn't any major economic fallout yet from the tariffs because he did not enact the highest tariffs possible. So right now, he's kind of sitting at a point where he feels like he can kind of get away with maintaining the pressure that exists. And that pressure is enough to actually get other countries to the table. And so in Canada's situation, there is this understanding that, you got to kind of get a deal done fast on some of these issues where, you're starting to feel the pressure, like on autos, on steel and aluminum. And you got to find a way not to agitate Trump further, that he ratchets up the pressure in addition to what's already there. So I think for Canada, it's a balancing act and one in which they're going to have to dance very carefully around some of these mines that Trump is throwing down.
So just quickly then to close with both of you, that's kind of a depressing take. What do we do now in the wake of this, Julian?
Well, that's how the math works, that we're more dependent. But any negotiator is going to say, I don't need anything that you have. I don't need anything that you have. It's not credible. I think it was interesting to hear the Americans criticize Canada's approach as being too complex. We want it to be as complete as possible. Yes, there's going to be CUSMA negotiations, but we do not want to be salami sliced. We do not want every time the president has a new idea that he's going to question the deal and then we've got to start again. So I think that's what it looks like, trying to come to an acceptable agreement, knowing that there's no way of fully protecting ourselves for the rest of his tenure as president.
And quickly, Inu, do you think we can land this plane?
I definitely think there's a way that Prime Minister Carney can get this deal done in a safe manner. So I think that at the end of the day, if we're looking at sort of the timelines for all these negotiations, in a way, it's not so bad that Canada wasn't at the top of the list. I think when the president is focused on you, it's usually a bad sign. It means he really wants something and he wants something now. So the fact of the matter is that Canada's sort of been dragging out this negotiation with the U.S., and that's okay. I think it's good to wait to make sure we get it right, but also to have this deadline that gives a little bit of a moment to announce something that can give President Trump enough wind to keep going. So I think there's a way to do it. I think giving away the digital service tax was a good first step, and we'll see what else can be done, but I'm hopeful.
Well, 2 weeks, we'll see. Julian Ovens, Inu Manik, thank you so much.
Thanks, Janyce.
Thank you.
The digital services tax was Donald Trump's first kill, but now he's back to rounding on the Canadian industry that really seems to cheese him off. Canadian dairy lovers are manning their battle stations.
It is so exciting. This tent is absolutely packed with cheese lovers that have driven I don't know how long to show their love for Canadian cheese.
When we stopped in at the Great Canadian Cheese Festival in May, nearly every booth had samples. So many kinds of cheese. Wine, too. It was so crowded that you needed your elbows up just to get at them.
As well, it's all made locally.
This one's excellent.
Cow's Creamery is best known as an ice cream maker from Prince Edward Island. But today, Roxanne Renwick is showing off her cheeses to a line of eager festival goers.
I am very passionate about the success of Canadian cheesemakers. It's a challenging industry to be in. We are all spread out, so our costs for making this beautiful ancient cheese is much higher than other countries.
Now, this show is set up on the grounds of Fort Henry in Kingston. That's where Lake Ontario flows into the St. Lawrence River. When the fort was built, it was strategically located to defend critical trade routes from American attacks. What the organizers of this event are mounting now is a strategic defense for Canada's dairy industry. The foot soldiers are these hungry and curious consumers.
It's really important for us to support our small dairy makers here in this country.
I love it. I'm from a dairy farm,
so
I really appreciate everything that's happening here today and what you've done for this.
It's just like, it's filling the cup, as the kids say. It's wonderful.
After a few wine samples in the fun atmosphere of a marketing event like this, it's easier to see Canada's glass as half full. But these are anxious days for Canadian dairy farmers now that Donald Trump is once again whinging about the rules that protect this industry from foreign imports.
So my name is Shep Eiselstein, and I'm with Gunshill Artisan Cheese. We're a small cheese maker near Woodstock, Ontario. And basically we use milk from my family's dairy farm and then make it into different types of lesser-known Swiss-style cheeses.
There's a real kind of elbows up sort of consumer push on right now because there's, trade threats.
Yeah.
How does that affect your business?
So what I can say quite clearly at this point in time is that the push to buy local has really improved sales for us. We're really surprised to see, because sales were kind of flat for the last couple of years because specialty cheese is an expensive item and food inflation really kind of put some pressure on people. But now, I would say at least 10% higher than they would have been versus last April or last March, for example, which I really think has to do with the people's push to buy Canadian, which is amazing.
So you're having a good trade war.
Yeah, at the moment, yes. That said, the threats are very real to our economy, but also specifically to dairy, because it's a supply managed industry, and it's something that's those south of the border are always kind of pushing hard against, and so there's always still that fear.
In plain language, can you explain to someone who might not understand the supply management system why it is so important to a business like yours and why you'd like to protect it?
Basically, supply management manages how much milk is produced. And the reason for doing that is so they can maintain a consistent and fair price for the dairy farmers. And so it's been around for 60 years now, and dairy farming in Canada is just a lot more steady. Smaller farms are much more possible, and it really kind of helps rural communities because farmers are actually making some money. Otherwise, if you go south of the border, farms are massive. They're not really leaving anything in the local community. Plus, dairy farming is so difficult there just to even break even.
Come on, try some cheese. So this is Stonetown. We're from St. Mary's, Ontario, so right outside St. Stratford.
Donald Trump's administration wasn't the first to go after the way Canada protects its dairy sector. He has, however, escalated this long-standing global trade irritant with a whole lot of misleading rhetoric about how Canada's quotas really work. What farmers are defending now isn't just their products, it's also their principles.
For people that don't know our business, we have a master cheesemaker from Switzerland as a partner, and he brought all those recipes over and makes the cheese. So I don't take any credits for the cheese. I still milk the cows. So.
Cheesemaker Hans Weber is the founder of Stonetown Artisan Cheese. He invested in Canada, believing his business would be protected here.
Hopefully we never drop our system, because we have friends in Australia, we have friends in New Zealand, and we know how bad they got hit when they got rid of the quota. And I rather have a good system and make a living from my milk price instead living off the government, like from subsidies, and no, that's not my way. And I know sometimes consumers think it's more money for them, and that maybe it's a little bit more money, but we don't have those industrial farms here. We have more family farms still here. We can keep them longer. I don't know what the future will bring, but I think it's a good system overall.
But is it a system whose time has passed? Even if the House of Commons just unanimously voted to pass a law to protect it, could Canada be forced now to dismantle supply management to save other, more valuable parts of its economy? If import controls like those massive prohibitive tariffs that Trump rails about, if they're removed, that may look like freer trade, but in fact, as Hans just explained, farmers in the U.S. and elsewhere receive huge subsidies from their governments to keep consumer dairy prices low. Even Roxanne from Cow's Creamery, one of Canada's most recognized premium dairy brands, worries about being overwhelmed.
So Canada is right next to one of the largest producers of cheese and milk in the world, and we cannot, due to economies of scale, ever compete with them. If we let a flood of American cheese in, that has so much more resources, so much more subsidies, then we won't have a dairy industry. So we have to protect the dairy industries. And look at the people here today. They're here. They're telling me that Canadian cheese is important, and they're standing here waiting for me to serve them. So it's been a pleasure, but I got to get back to selling my cheese.
Thank you, Roxanne. Cows come in two kinds, of course. One you milk to make that cheese. The other goes on your barbecue. Bill 202, the law Parliament just passed, rules out any more trade concessions from Canada's dairy, egg, and poultry sectors. Canada's beef industry isn't protected. The majority of Canadian agriculture, including livestock producers, relies on free trade across the border. Here's how Saskatchewan rancher Carla Hicks reacted to Trump's tariff threats.
Well, the first few days, to be totally honest, were pretty frightening. When the first talk of tariffs came down at 25%, we had loads of finished cattle going through the border in Alberta, and it worked out to about $1,000 a head or $40,000 a load. We're already seeing the highest prices for beef being paid in this history due to low supply. And that tariff was eroding all profit. Like, there was going to be zero profit left. And I don't think it's a secret. Ranching, being in the beef industry, hasn't been the most fun for the last 15, 20 years outside of 2 or 3 good years. We seem to feel every world tremor that comes through. So it was actually quite terrifying.
Canada has a new law in place now, just passed, that prevents trade negotiators from conceding any more of the market for the protected supply managed sectors, dairy, egg, and poultry. But the beef industry fought that bill. Why?
Well, we mostly just fought the speed of it. Bill C-202 was never about supply management. It's about trade policy. And it was fast-tracked by members of the Parliament with no consultation and no debate. So that's what worried us the most. At a time when Canada should be focusing on strengthening our trade diversification and opening new markets for Canadian goods, we're just disappointed to see Canada's parliamentarians prioritize protectionism through legislation.
What are you afraid might happen now that it's law, particularly in the midst of talks with the Trump administration?
Well, I think we're probably afraid of every scenario. And to be totally honest, we don't even like to talk about it. We're hoping that it just kind of goes away quietly and we can work out a great trade deal without even worrying about this bill being out there, because we all know how trade can be with the United States, and the United States is our number one trading partner. So we just need every positive factor out there working in our favor.
I've heard it expressed by some people as Trump always likes to feel like he's getting something. So if he isn't getting something from those farm sectors, he's going to look to other places to get something from Canada. Does your industry feel like it has a target on its back now?
I hope not. But again, these are hard questions to answer because we just never know how the bottle will spin, right? The export market is so important to Canada. We export over half of the beef that we raise, much like the automobile industry. The beef industry has set itself up so that we go back and forth, either live on the hoof or by pieces, and we feed their cattle here, they feed our cattle there, we slaughter both sides of the border. The supply chain is so tight, and we need each other for exporting and importing. I always think about the beef industry kind of like a dog. The United States is like the body of the dog, and Canada is like the tail, but it's all necessary. We're all completely 100% integrated. The North American beef industry is so integrated.
I want to ask you a political question to close then. This bill we talked about was put forward by the Bloc Québécois. Quebec nationalists always fight to protect the dairy industry, but in Western Canada, where you are, it is dominated by large-scale grain growers, livestock operations that need those export markets. Is there a tension now in rural Canada? Has Donald Trump succeeded in dividing your sector?
Well, I would say Donald Trump has probably exposed some cracks for sure. And more conversations definitely need to be had. We're in a place right now in Canada where everybody is all about unity, especially coming out of Canada Day. I think we've seen it more than ever. We're hoping these interprovincial trade barriers are dropped and we can become more unified that way. So for sure, Donald Trump has opened up a lot of conversations. We'll put it that way.
Carla Hicks, summer's a busy time for ranchers. Thank you for giving me a bit of yours.
Thanks for having me on.
Saskatchewan rancher Carla Hicks. Coming up on the House podcast, the International Trade Minister on whether Canada really can wean itself from its reliance on the United States. I'm Janyce McGregor, and you're listening to a special edition of The House, Making Politics Make Sense. Make sure to give us a follow in your podcast feed so you never miss an episode. While Canada's trade relationship with the U.S. remains uncertain, it's going to need other allies more than ever. And that's where International Trade Minister Maninder Sidhu comes in. We spoke to the minister on Friday in what was his first broadcast interview since being named to Cabinet. Minister Sidhu, welcome to the House.
Thanks for having me, Janice. It's good to be here in Calgary with you.
I'm going to be honest with you. I've been covering trade issues for about the last decade or so, and I feel like I have seen this movie before. The Canadian government being worried about being too reliant on the U.S., wanting to wean itself off by pursuing preferential trade deals with new partners. What's different now?
I think what you see what's happening down south of the border is what's different now, right? It's a different time that we're in. Traditionally, in my experience, having spent 13 years in international trade prior to politics, businesses were comfortable dealing with the U.S., language, proximity, they were comfortable with that. And now Canadian businesses are contacting me, asking me to open up new global markets because of the order books drying up in the U.S. And so I believe when I was in the private sector, I had to do a lot of convincing to get businesses to utilize trade agreements back then, international trade agreements other than the U.S. And now businesses are coming to the government saying, let's do this together.
But I guess the question is whether it's going to work this time. Because I remember hearing kind of similar things, even when the Harper government was thinking about pursuing a trade deal with the European Union. We landed that deal. It's been provisionally applied for a long time. Trade with Europe is up a bit, but it has not displaced the dependence with the U.S. So why are you confident that this is going to work?
Look, I think right now, even international partners, with the challenges that we're facing down south, I see opportunities in those challenges, right? In my first week after being sworn in, I was in Ecuador. We just wrapped up negotiations of the Canada-Ecuador free trade agreement. I just met with the UAE. We're concluding our FIPA agreement. And so there's an appetite with partners and allies all around the world to do more with Canada. And so there's an opportune window that we have to jump on, and I'm going to be at the forefront of that.
What would success look like for you? Do you have a percentage of the trade overall that you're hoping to shift to new places?
Success to me is getting businesses more comfortable dealing with overseas markets. I've traditionally always seen that in the private sector before politics. You're seeing a little bit of that now. And so how can government help facilitate some of those conversations? And so, in the coming months, I'll be taking out delegations. I also see a lot of opportunities, if we're going to be investing $9 billion in defense. Prime Minister Carney has been very clear we need to build up that industrial capacity here in Canada. Currently, as you know, Janice, 75 cents of every dollar we send in procurement goes to the U.S. And so if we're spending Canadian taxpayers' money and making these big investments, Canadians should see the value in those investments. And so, building up that capacity through exports is very important to sustain industries here in Canada.
But do you have to be kind of discreet about this new kind of wooing of new partnerships and spreading Canada around a little bit, lest it attract attention in Washington?
I don't think so. Look, people are looking to Canada. Look, here in Calgary, there's a lot of delegations that just came for the Global Energy Summit, from all around the world. I was at CanSec in Ottawa, where you had over 41 international delegations coming to Canada looking at some of our innovation and expertise. And so I think Canada has a lot to offer, and we should be, screaming that at the top of our lungs.
Okay, well, let's talk about some of the regions. We don't have time to tour the world and talk about everything you're up to on all the different fronts, but a couple of the big players, okay? First, the UK was out with a new strategy this week for its trade. It talked about deepening ties with Canada, but it was the British side, actually, that walked away from its bilateral trade talks over a year and a half ago. So are you getting any signals from the UK that they're ready to come back to the table now?
Look, the UK is an important partner for Canada. You saw that in Prime Minister Carney's first trip overseas, right? And in Paris at the OECD, I met with Secretary Reynolds, my counterpart, to talk UK-Canada relations, how we can build upon that. And currently with what we have, the Trade Continuity Agreement, we have access to 99% of the market here, right? And so trade is traditionally going up, and how do we continue building on that momentum is going to be the conversation going forward. But in addition to that, Prime Minister Starmer was also here, as you know, and there was an announcement that we worked on together, $4 billion for Zenobie and the city of Brampton to help facilitate the electrification of Brampton Transit. And so that's going to provide 5,000 good paying jobs. So there's partnerships that we're finding across the board beyond just defense.
Yeah, and I appreciate that. But I mean, in terms of the bilateral talks that were on and then they were off, the UK walked away because its farmers weren't prepared to ease the restrictions on Canadian meat exports. Canada wasn't prepared to give up any more of its cheese market. And actually, Parliament's passed a law now to double down on those feelings. Is that still blocking a return to the table?
Look, I think Canada has always remained at the negotiating table, and it's important.
Right, but they left, though. Are they prepared to come back now?
Well, you've heard the signs, right, with Prime Minister's conversations with his counterpart. And, you know, speaking of supply management, we've been very, very clear that we'll never dismantle supply management. I recently met with dairy producers and farmers a couple of weeks ago to stress that as well, that we'll always stand for Canadian workers.
So that's going to stand in the way, maybe, of getting them back to the bilateral table, those cheese letters.
I always like to see the brighter side of things, Janyce, and I think, you know, within challenges, you also come across opportunities, and I think we want to focus on those opportunities.
Okay, let's go to another part of the world. At the G7, Canada and India announced that they were going to restore their diplomatic relationship once again, appoint high commissioners, process visas as before. Can you see a path where Canada's trade talks with India, which Canada paused, that massive consumer market, could those also be resuming?
When you ask about India, I think about my riding. I'm an MP from Brampton East, one of the largest South Asian communities in one single riding. And what my constituents and what Canadians are asking me for is more connectivity between Canada and India. That comes in the terms of flights, more access. You can speak to many different communities from India, and they'll all tell you the same thing, that we need more access, we need more connectivity. But when it comes to trade and business-to-business dealings, that hasn't stopped, Janyce. That's been continuing over the last number of years on an upward trajectory, right? And so how do we continue building on that is important with those conversations. And, you know, I think those conversations will continue.
But do you feel you don't need the bilateral trade deal that your predecessor was starting to work on with India? Because it is a huge market, and India is notoriously protectionist in its relationships, trade relationships. And the feeling was by the business community that Canada would really do well to get that deal. It would really help diversify. So are we deciding at this moment, we can't, it's too sensitive, we're going to have to forgo that?
Look, as you've heard from the Minister of Foreign Affairs, it's a step-by-step approach, right? And, restoring those diplomatic relations to a level with the high commissioners is very, very important. It's very important to get our trade commissioner services to the same level to ensure that we're able to continue to talk about some of that economic activity and see where that goes. But again, step-by-step, I think, is what we'll build on.
We're not there yet.
Look, I think there's a lot of things to be worked out, and so some of the G7 conversations were around that, and I think, we need to work through those and continue building on that.
I want to talk about one other massive consumer market. China is still pressuring Canada with its famous commodity diplomacy, where it puts high tariffs on things like canola oil and meal and peas, pork, those major exports, especially for Western Canada, where you are right now. Can you see a path where Canada's relationship with China improves and those tariffs lift?
Look, I think the Chinese market is very important for Canada. There's no doubt about it. And so when I was in Paris a few weeks ago, I sat across the table from my counterpart, Minister Wong, and we talked about a lot of these things, access for canola, beef, pet food, and many other products. And it's important that we continue those diplomatic conversations. And so we agreed, along with the Prime Minister and his counterpart, to get back to the table through the JETSI Commission, the Joint Economic and Trade Commission, to work through some of these issues and problems. And I see there is an openness to that. And so we'll continue building on that. But the first part is to have those conversations being started. And it's something that's been brought to my attention, through many different agriculture associations, but including my colleague, the Minister of Agriculture as well.
Yeah, I'm imagining that's got to be tough sledding, though, with things so sensitive with the U.S. at the moment.
Look, I think having spent 4 years at Global Affairs as a parliamentary secretary, at development, at foreign affairs, at trade, it's really taught me that diplomacy can do wonders, and we need to make sure that we're able to have those conversations with countries around the world, and that's exactly what I'll be doing.
July 21st, which is the deadline that was set for resolving the tariff dispute with Washington, that's coming up really fast. If that deal doesn't land, realistically, can any of the work you've been doing with these other international partners even begin to offset the damage that's coming for Canada's economy?
What I've talked to businesses about across the country, Janyce, is it's not going to happen overnight, but it's a willingness from businesses, from communities, from provinces and territories, sitting across the table from my counterpart here in Alberta, Minister Scow, about how we can work together in our diversification efforts. And so it really is a Team Canada approach, and it's good to see that. But beyond that, you're seeing historic movement. Just on Monday, you saw the first LNG shipment leave Kitimat, BC, to the Indo-Pacific region, right? Traditionally, most of our LNG has gone to the U.S., and now we've just unlocked a new market to help with more of those diversification efforts. And there's 6 more projects in the pipeline for LNG, and so that is really going to drive things forward. And I think, it's encouraging for Canadians to see that and to know that.
So you're seeing some green shoots. Before I let you go, I just want to ask you a more personal question. Before you ran for office, people may not know this about you. You were a customs broker, which actually is the person who helps importers and exporters navigate regulations and tariffs. So you have frontline experience in what tariffs do to the business community. What did you learn from that business background that's actually affecting what you're trying to do now as a minister?
You brought back some great memories, 13 years of dealing with hundreds of businesses across the country to help facilitate trade and really teaching businesses how to utilize free trade agreements, duties, tariffs, quotas, whatnot. Back then, the challenge was to break down government policy into a practical perspective, right? So how do businesses understand government policy? Now I'm on the other end, where I get to take that practical experience, take government policy and mend the two to make sure they work for businesses. And so as Canada's top salesman, I'll be doing more of that. And I'm very lucky to be in this position, by the blessings of Prime Minister Carney, to make sure that I'm able to grow upon that experience, because we're in a unique time right now. And so as Canada's top salesman, you're going to see more and more engagement with business across Canada, but more on the international scene to make sure we're able to open up those markets and continue to see that growth.
Shoes on the other foot. Maninder Sidhu, thank you so much for making some time for us.
Thanks, Janyce. Take care. Hope to see you soon.
Maninder Sidhu is Canada's Minister of International Trade.
Just free trade in Canada is $200 billion for Canada.
We've heard that $200 billion figure a lot. It's the potential economic value, a best case scenario of dropping all of Canada's internal trade barriers. But the Canada Day deadline has come and gone. And well, some provinces still have their elbows up. That $200 billion estimate comes from Calgary economist Trevor Toombs' modeling. I asked him, if all the barriers come down, could we really expect that kind of growth?
It would take many years, potentially decades, for those full gains to materialize. And so we're really talking about boosting growth by about 0.1, maybe 0.2% per year. And that's really hard to notice. $200 billion sounds big, and certainly would be big if it came in one immediate boost to the Canadian economy. But it requires a compounding of small gains over many years to achieve.
thinking about this, how sometimes politicians find an impressive number that matches their message and it starts getting thrown around in debates about trade without the necessary caveats or the full context. Well, that brought to mind a book I read this past winter. Listen to the confession that its author, a former trade negotiator, makes on its opening page.
I am very sorry. I once led a trade negotiation so impenetrably dull and infuriating that my boss said our top priority was to ensure he never had to explain it to our trade minister. I am fully aware the average human being would rather eat a broken glass salad than read about the small print of a World Trade Organization tariff schedule. I get it. Unfortunately, trade is important, and important people keep lying to us about it.
Dmitry Grozovitsky, as an Australian trade consultant, you may think that you have something to apologize for, but Canadians like to believe we dominate the market when it comes to unnecessary apologies. And I was not sorry to read your book, Why Politicians Lie About Trade. It spoke frankly and clearly and sometimes hilariously about issues that have really upended the global political agenda. So thank you for this book and welcome to the House.
Thank you so much for having me. And let me just say that when I wrote it, I did not anticipate the frankly over-the-top guerrilla marketing campaign the Trump administration would run for it over these last few months.
Well, let's start there. Look, trade policy, as I have studied and reported on it over the last decade or so, it's often dominated by two things, frankly. Economic data, stats, modeling, and legal rules like agreements. Those are both supposed to be more about facts than feelings or opinions. How do political debates about trade become so rife with misinformation?
I think actually that perception that trade policy is driven by economic modeling and data and the hard facts on the ground is some fantastic marketing work on the part of the trade policy community, but it's never reflected reality. If you look around at the settings governments have about the way borders work, about which sectors are protected and which sectors they strive to get access into, it has always been primarily a political calculation driven by which interests are more vocal, which sectors are in the news, and so on. What we're seeing now is a kind of natural endpoint to that process where that politicization has gone from the back rooms onto our front pages.
It's a big deal, though, to accuse politicians of straight up lying, like the title of your book does. At least it used to be a big deal to accuse a politician of lying. I don't know. Maybe things are different now in 2025. But why do you think that word fits?
So I understand that journalists like yourselves have to be really cautious about that word because a lie implies a premeditated decision to deceive, when, of course, sometimes someone will make a statement that is incorrect or which they didn't know to be incorrect. The reason I use that term, and I use it provocatively and deliberately, is for me, I think when you have access to the resources that political leaders have, all of the world's information at your fingertips, and you still come out with statements that are deceptive and could have been checked with a single Google search or question to one of your staff, then for me, I don't care if you were simply lazy or willfully deceptive. What you're doing is you're taking away from the public the opportunity to make an informed assessment of the choices you're making on their behalf. And for me, that is lying. And so that's why I use that word.
Is it that politicians are lying, or are they just kind of spinning, being selective, cherry picking?
Obviously, there is a spectrum. The book is not called Everything a Politician Has Ever Said About Trade is a Lie. There are cases where I think they bend the truth well beyond breaking point and well beyond what we would tolerate. But in many cases, yes, it is just spin or perhaps just trying to explain complexity and perhaps leaving some things on the cutting room floor.
I think maybe it's a good time then to get into some of what you've identified as false claims that politicians make about trade agreements, for example. So you have a phrase in your book, you talk about these being rhetorical flourishes that could generously be described as marketing, but less charitably as BS. And you gave an example of politicians saying that a deal slashes red tape. Why is a phrase like that, for example, a red flag for you?
For me, a red flag in any kind of policy discussion is when you start leaning on cliches and vague platitudes, right? When someone asks you how you're going to pay for something and you say, oh, I'll eliminate inefficiencies, but you don't list what those are. Trade policy is absolutely rife with these because most people don't really understand how it works. And everything you are talking about is gigantic, complex processes involving hundreds of actors over many years. So the reason that I think that statements like that are BS is, for example, when you talk about cutting red tape, what we think about as red tape is regulations and procedures that governments make businesses undertake in order to prove that their products are safe, that they've paid the appropriate taxes, that they are of the standards that are fitting to be sold on our shelves or to our consumers. And that is never going away. No government, generally speaking, is comfortable with saying, well, you can sell us anything, and if it kills some of our citizens, that'll be a bad marketing day for you. So when you hear politicians talk about slashing red tape, what they inevitably kind of mean is they will fiddle around a little bit with the processes that businesses go through. But what they're trying to have you imagine is all of those processes going away when that is never their intention.
False advertising, really.
Absolutely. And look, this is a function of our media environment. If you are a trade minister, announcing a trade agreement is about the coolest thing you ever get to do in terms of demonstrating to the public that, hey, I am taking action and championing Canadian business, for example. And the challenge for trade ministers is that most trade agreements just aren't that spectacular. And so if you want to sell them as a crowning achievement and as something that should propel your political career forward on the wings of success, you have to begin bending the truth about what will actually change for somebody moving goods or services across borders.
This book came out last year. That was before the tariff wars of Donald Trump's second presidency. But you wrote a whole chapter about politicians using national security to justify protectionism. And we've seen Trump doing that very thing this spring. You warned readers that we're probably going to be in for a wild ride. Why was this predictable?
I think with Donald Trump especially, but I think this is a phenomenon that goes beyond him. Politicians of his ilk operate on a where is it written I cannot do this kind of basis. They are forever looking to expand the actions they can take unilaterally without checks and balances, or at least sidestepping a lot of those checks and balances, because they believe that having been elected, they should be able to govern as they see fit. To me, the challenge with national security is this tension that on the one hand, obviously and intuitively, there are aspects of trade that touch on national security. If you have a geopolitical rival, you might want to think twice about letting them build your national power grid. For example, that is a legitimate concern to have. So clearly there must be ways that you can invoke national security to take a second look at trade investment. But at the same time, national security has always been something that governments have felt like they could define on their own. No one else gets to tell a government what is not a legitimate national security concern. And when you put those two things together, the temptation is obvious. If I get to define what a national security concern is, and something being a national security concern means I can do whatever I like. The temptation for me is to declare everything to be a national security concern and then operate in an unpredictable maximalist way. And so we could see that coming years in advance as increasingly politicians reach not just Trump, though heavily President Trump, began reaching for this national security lever. It with increasingly flimsy connections and less obvious connections back to the actual security of the country. To go from, well, maybe our rivals shouldn't build our power grid to it is absolutely vital that we have a national car industry because something, tech and innovation in the war sector, it's never been clear. You could see them tiptoeing down that road to hell, some with good intentions and some with not.
But if it's all self-defining, if it's all however he wants to set the rules for himself, does that leave us powerless then in the wake of Trump's tactics?
I think this is a really difficult question for Canadians. The way I tend to visualize a lot of what is happening is some combination of hostage taking and extortion. The U.S. consumer is hugely valuable to Canada. A lot of Canadians rely for part or all of their livelihood on being able to sell to Americans and to draw in American capital as investments. And when Donald Trump, who has the ability to do this under various aspects of U.S. law, including national security, threatens that, that is something the Canadian government has to take very, very seriously. And it's unfortunate because in a just world, you say we don't negotiate with hostage takers and you hold the line and you feel morally superior. But the fact of the matter is, the reason we often negotiate with hostage takers is the hostages are valuable to us. And in this case, the hostages are valuable to Canada. Now, Canada does have options, as it showed. The Canadian government can counterpunch in certain ways that cause Americans pain. In many ways, a trade war is an exchange of pain. They hurt you and you hurt them back. And it is not a zero-sum exchange of pain either, because the people that are being hurt by, for example, a Canadian tariff on the U.S. aren't necessarily the people who are benefiting from an American tariff on Canada, and so on and so forth. So there is ways that you can punch back asymmetrically, though of course they are a larger economy. And, politics matters quite a lot here. I think in the face of these tariffs, Canadians came together and got quite angry, and sort of this elbows up mentality of, listen, we're being bullied, we're under siege, we can endure some pain here. I don't think you necessarily saw that in the United States because politicians lie about trade sometimes. Americans were told that these trade wars of Donald Trump's making would be painless for them, that tariffs would be paid by foreigners, that jobs would rush back, that prices would come down. And the fact of the matter is that's not true. So the U.S. tolerance for pain, I think, is significantly lower than in countries like Canada, who may have more to lose on paper, but who have a much stronger kind of political solidarity in the face of what's happening. So as we saw in the initial wave of tariffs, when Canada threatened to fight back, when the full implications of trade barriers on the North American continent hit U.S. markets and U.S. headlines, Donald Trump came back to the table, and many of the threats didn't entirely dematerialize, but were significantly reduced. Now, will that happen every time? It's not certain. Will he, sort of having licked the stove, nursed his wounds a little bit, and potentially forgotten what it feels like, come back for another go? It's entirely possible, and we're all staring down the barrel of what's about to happen on the 9th of July. But the fact of the matter is the Canadian government does have some options, but none of those options are guaranteed or painless, which is why this is going to be a real challenge for the government.
You make your living now as a trainer in Geneva. This is the home of the World Trade Organization, a place that is premised on upholding trade rules. But now we have Paul populist politicians telling voters they don't need to follow rules anymore. Are we lying to ourselves if we believe that?
I think we're lying to ourselves if we believe that the World Trade Organization can externally impose limits on countries who fundamentally don't believe the limit should be there anymore. That's never how the system worked or was supposed to work. At the end of the day, the World Trade Organization is the home for a bunch of treaties. Governments made a bunch of promises to one another to set some limits because they didn't want a situation exactly like what we're seeing today, where trade becomes capricious, unpredictable, a tool of bilateral diplomacy or even domestic politics. And they all agreed that would be bad and made some promises to each other. But the strength of the institution, the ability of that institution to bind all of its participants, always depended on people fundamentally accepting that those promises have value and should be honored. So I think to the extent that the World Trade Organization can be useful, it still absolutely can. Hundreds of countries worldwide still believe in the rules and still try to cling to them and still value the predictability, transparency, and ability to amicably resolve disputes that it offers. But when it comes to the major issues between the major players, those will almost certainly have to be solved first in capitals, in conversations between Brussels and Ottawa, Washington and Beijing, what have you. And then perhaps once an equilibrium emerges, brought into the system in a new set of treaties that capture our collective understanding of how trade should work.
So you're not out of a living yet, then maybe, Dimitri. Thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you so much. A pleasure to join the House.
Dimitri Grozobinski is the author of Why Politicians Lie About Trade. That's it for us this week. Our crew on the House is Kristen Everson, Benjamin Lopez-Stephen, Victoria Valito, and our senior producer is Jennifer Chevalier. Technical production by Conrad Ajazi. I'm Janyce McGregor. Thanks for listening.